Unfortunately, in kind of our modern context, a lot of the time we talk about belief and faith divorced from the idea of what you actually do. And this series is trying to put that back together and fuse that back together with doing good. And so today we will focus on the practical actions you can take to love your neighbor as yourself. But much like the disciples, I think sometimes we get into the trap of saying, well, who's really my neighbor? I saw this comic this last week. I thought it was kind of funny. This guy introducing a new coworker. He said, welcome, I'm sure you'll fit in nicely. And they're dressed exactly the same, and they look exactly the same. And this is the challenge, is that so many times we think of our neighbor as someone that looks just like me, basically has the same values as me, acts like me, lives in a similar house to me, speaks like I speak, has their life together like I do. And so, unfortunately, we don't get credit for loving people that are just exactly pretty much duplicates of myself. We don't get credit for loving clones. That's normal. Everyone does that. What we need to push ourselves to do is to love those that are different than ourselves, that look different, that act different, that maybe don't have as much, or maybe speak coarsely, or maybe vote completely differently, or maybe act out of hand and just odd. Maybe doesn't have a good social IQ or a emotional IQ, if you will. Doesn't raise their kids like I do. Doesn't carry the same values I do. Doesn't vote like me. But here's the thing. None of that is what you've been asked to consider. You've merely been asked to love your neighbor as yourself. And that's the rub, isn't it? Because it's easy to love people just like myself. If I can look at you and it's like looking in the mirror and I go, yeah, I identify with this person, it's easy to love that back. That's loving yourself. It's difficult to love the person that looks different than you, that acts different than you, that you maybe look down your nose at. It's difficult to love that person like you love yourself. And yet that's what Jesus teaches us. If we roll back to the Old Testament, there's a text there in Micah 6:8. It says, the Lord has told you what is good. And this is what he requires of you to do what is right, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. I mean, we struggle with this. Like, what does God want me to do? What does the Father expect of me? And it's actually quite simple. And it's so good. Like, it transcends cultural differences. It transcends different continents. It transcends different value systems. Anyone could look at this and go, this is really nice. This is really good. This is beautiful. Now, you may have heard that they've discovered something new, something that's been maybe seems tacked on, but it obviously changes. This text has changed, and the meaning is a little bit different. Because except in an election year, and then it's on like Donkey Kong, and then you just treat people however you want to treat them. You just look at whatever the world's doing, and you just copy that. That's exactly what you do. For those of you that don't know, I am being facetious here. That's not there. That's what our world seems like right now, but this is the text. The text is very simple. What you've been asked to do is not complicated. It doesn't change. When people talk about God not changing, this is some of what we're talking about. The foundational things of God do not change. People will change. Books will change. Governments will change. Value systems will change. In the course of my lifetime, I've gone from growing up with a phone on the wall that was on a party line that had a rotary to being able to send a message almost instantly, globally, to millions. Things will change, but when we say God doesn't change, that's something you can build your life on. And this has not changed. This is what God requires of you. To do what is right, to love mercy, to walk humbly. At the end of the day, what we've been talking about every single week still applies. Practicing is greater than preaching. I hate to say that as a preacher. But it's true. It's absolutely true. What we do with our life is so infinitely more valuable than what we talk about what we want to do with our life. Living out your faith. That's the sweet spot of our life. Today we're going to look at a story in Matthew 22, and it is one of my favorite texts there. And so what I want you to hear in this brief story is this idea of what does it mean to treat my neighbor. And I think some of us struggle with that a little bit because we're like, well, I would like to define my neighbor as what I would like to define my neighbor as. I don't really want anyone else to tell me that. But in Matthew 22, we see this idea of what it means to really follow our neighbor. So if you would, listen there for just a second. Matthew 22, 36 through 40. And this is contained in a portion of Scripture that many of our Bibles will delineate as the most important commandment. The most important commandment. So if we were going to boil down, not even the 10 Commandments, and certainly not the hundreds of things in Deuteronomy or all the laws in the Old Testament, but what is the most important? This is what they're asking him. So, one of an expert in the law said, "Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses?" And Jesus replied, so this is Jesus speaking. He says, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments." So what Jesus has done here is taken thousands of years of history and thousands of pages of the Old Testament, what's called the Hebrew Bible. All that law, not just Moses, but all the prophets, all the commandments, and says, look, the entire law is summed up in these two phrases. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Equally important. They work together. They cannot be separated from each other. Now, that has become problematic over the past several thousand years because people are like, then they want to define what a neighbor is. And Jesus, knowing that, said, no. It's not who you decide your neighbor is. Your neighbor is who needs your help. And so the parable of the Good Samaritan clearly teaches that story. Jesus would later teach that so that they would get that concept. But it does bring up a question to us about who we are able to relate to, doesn't it? Because I tend to relate best to people that get me and my kind of what I'm interested in, my hobbies, raise their kids like I raise my kids, see the world the way I do. And it's very difficult to see people on the other side of that, isn't it? Unless you're just someone that really tries hard at that, or you're someone that's weird, right? I'm a little weird. I get that. I have a lot of atheist friends, and we talk, and I have a lot of friends that don't believe in a lot of things, and we have great conversations. And I think one of the things that we share a mutual respect for is both of us really speak the same language often about this concept of doing. What has been called by some scholars as Jamesian Christianity. You look at the book of James, and it's about this idea of that Christianity is not primarily about memorization and thinking about things and holding that secretly, but it's this idea of the city on a hill that cannot be hidden. It's this idea of how Jesus didn't just teach philosophy, but was willing to go to the cross and die for us. About how God didn't just say, I'm thinking about you, but actually sent a rescue plan for us in the person of Jesus to an earth with blood and sweat and sand and heat. Didn't just sit in a throne far detached in heaven and say, oh, I pity them, but actually sent a rescue to us. There's the difference between preaching only and practicing. As I think about my neighbors, and if I want to extend that to maybe Oklahoma County, right? So let's think about all the people in Oklahoma County. There are some people in Oklahoma County that I think are the salt of the earth, that I just love. I think are brilliant people. A lot of them are in this room. I enjoy their company. I find what they do with their life very exciting and interesting. And then there are some people in Oklahoma County that if I saw them on the other side of the street, I would probably try to run away, right? Like, I just don't get them. They scare me. It's that kind of thing when you see someone at the mall and you're like, you see them far enough away and you're like, I'm going to duck in here. And then you're like, oh no, I'm in the cookie shop again. Well, I guess I better buy something. Like, you know the feeling. You know the feeling when you're like, oh, just avoid, you're at Walmart and you're like, I'm going to go back to Sporting Goods one more time because just to avoid this person. So we all know this is true. at a certain level. There are people we would love to avoid. And the difficult thing is, we've been asked to love those people that we find personally repulsive, that we personally find we don't have any agreement with. They fly a flag on their truck that we're like, oh, they put a sign in their yard and we're like, morons. They cut us off in traffic and we're like, just holding everything back or learning new words, and our kids are having to learn new words. Everything, this is how that we live. And so how do we love those people? Many of you have not seen this show, but some of you have. Home Improvement was one of my favorite shows growing up. And the fun thing about the show was Wilson was the neighbor, and you never saw his full face. He was always on the other side of the fence. So if you think about talking to your neighbor in your backyard, if you're a little shorter, then you would never see their face. And it was just really funny that he had this kind of wild relationship. Tim, the toolman Taylor here, had this wild relationship with his, what I would call chaotic neighbor. He always had something wild going on, or he was doing something that was very different than what you would think of as a normal kind of Midwestern neighbor. And but he had wise advice a lot of the time. But still, they seemed very different personalities. And Tim never understood what he was saying. That was kind of the running joke there. And so if you think about it, maybe there's someone that you don't quite get. Maybe they are your next door neighbor, or maybe they are someone down the street, or maybe there's someone in your kid's school district, or maybe in Oklahoma County, or maybe the state. Maybe it's a whole group of people you don't get. Maybe it's people from another country, or maybe it's people that have more than you or have less than you. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, we are called to love our neighbors. And we're called to love the people, especially when we disagree with them, especially when we don't get them. We're called to love them. In Matthew, we see it written like this: if you only love those who love you, what reward is there for that? For even the corrupt tax collectors do that. Man, that would have just rubbed them raw. They'd have been like, well, I'm nothing like a tax collector. But yeah, a tax collector loves their own family. And the tax collectors were just con artists extreme. If you see the people selling stuff on late night television, that's pretty much what people thought of tax collectors. Just rip-off artists. Just probably worse than that. Probably people that are ripping people off that you see on the news channels when they send the investigators out, right, that are cashing checks and never doing the work. It's that kind of terrible, like taking advantage of people. And so to be called a tax collector, or to be called out for behavior worse than a tax collector, that would have hit the audience bad. He continues, if you are only kind to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Even pagans do that. Even people with no belief system at all. He's like, they don't believe the Jewish beliefs. They don't believe in the Roman gods. They don't believe in Christianity. They believe in nothing. Don't believe in Jesus. Don't believe in anything. The pagans don't believe in any sort of God of any kind. They do that. They love their friends. So how are you any different? Again, one of those questions that kind of hurts to hear, and certainly would hurt to hear for his audience. This is an ouch moment. Jesus' followers are confronted with a truth, and we are confronted 2,000 years later with the same truth. How are we any different if we only show love to our friends? Now, this is where it gets really confusing, I think. This very next verse, verse 48. You are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. What? Most of us read this and disconnect real quick because we're like, well, I'm not perfect and I'm never going to be perfect, so good luck with all that. So I dug into this a little bit, right? And I read what most of the scholar consensus is on this, and it's that you have to take it in the context of the conversation. Not that you're going to be perfect in all ways, but you've been called to love perfectly. So, rewind, right? Go back 2 verses. If you only love people who love you, people that it's a transaction, what reward is there for that? Next verse. If you are only kind to your friends, how are you different? Setting us up for verse 48. You are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. God's love is perfect. What we learn from him is a love that goes towards people That even, even as Jesus hung on the cross and he said, Father, forgive them, he's showing love towards people that are being terrible to him and his family. And so, you're called to a perfect love. Now, are we there yet? Obviously not. But this is what our goal is. This is us shooting for the stars. This is our goal, is to love people. Not to be morally perfect, not to be ethically perfect. We always fall short of that, but to strive for perfection in love. God so loved the world, not one group of people, not one kind of people, not people that loved him back only. God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. God did that for us, even when we were enemies of God. That's huge. So if you flip that on your edge and you're being asked to do this, you're being asked to be like your Father in heaven with love. What's that mean? How many of your enemies have you loved lately? Sacrificially. Wow. That's huge. That's saying you're not doing things for people that can pay you back. You're not doing things for people that you kind of have this unspoken, you owe me, buddy, kind of thing. I took you to the airport, so you'll have to take me to the airport someday kind of thing. No. What would it be like to bless people, to love people like God loves them, the way of Jesus? And this is why we teach that following Jesus is the best plan for your life. And that's across the board. Following Jesus makes you a better husband. It makes you a better wife, makes you a better kid, makes you a better employee, makes you a better member of the community. It makes you a better person, a better student, a better citizen. Following the way of Jesus, not just saying you're following Jesus, but following the way of Christ does not make life easier, but it makes life better. It helps you be the best version of you that you can be. Because it supplants all of the selfish drives with a perfect love. For if you love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, you are pursuing love in two different ways. You're pursuing the love of your fellow human. You're pursuing the love of the Creator. And Jesus says those two things are what it's all about. That's what life is about. And so we believe the way of Jesus is superior. It begins with following Jesus. And as you follow Jesus, and as you begin the process of discipleship, which is kind of this definition of becoming a little bit more like Jesus every day, you don't overnight get there, you start to see the world differently. And formerly people that you envisioned as enemies or below you, or you look down your nose at, or how could they believe that? How could they do that? All of a sudden, you start to get a sense of how God sees them. And so you get to see with more than human eyes. You get to see them with the eyes of God they're not the enemy. They're just another fellow traveler. And look, you may never understand. You may never understand how a fellow Christ follower could be for what you're against. You may be passionate about some topic, and you may just never be able to comprehend how they could vote that way, how they could support that person, how they could do that. You may be just confused on how a Christian could ever do that, right? A fellow Christ follower, how would they ever get their value system aligned in that way? And that's okay. That's okay. That's got to be okay. Because at no point are we told you must agree with all other Christians. You must figure out their value system and align yours ideologically. Every decision you must agree with that another Christian makes. No, the only thing you're asked to do is to love one another. He says to love one another as I have loved you. You're told to love, even for people you don't get. And this is hard to do, right? I'm not here to preach this and be like, this is easy. This is difficult. This is crazy hard. This is why it pushes us beyond where we are and what the default of our culture is. Because our culture loves to just rah, 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 all day long, 24/7, never stop. And we can be countercultural if we say, I may never agree with you on this opinion you have. But it doesn't much matter, Because Jesus said, I don't have to worry about that. I only have to love you. It's why this conversation is going to be so important as we meet together this next week. And it's why this series has been important for us to think about how we love people that we may not understand their position in life. I know sometimes when I go downtown and I smell marijuana so strongly, and it is so confusing to me, like how you can afford drugs and not food, right? And I think it's a valid question. I'm not saying it's not a valid question. But at the end of the day, there's still hungry people. And there's children that are hungry, and there's children that are suffering. I know one of the homes we went into one time, just feces everywhere. We were bringing a bed to a child near the Capitol Hill area in Oklahoma City, and the smell of urine was just so strong, I almost got sick. And thinking about these children laying, as I took a mattress out, and I've told this story before, I picked the mattress up with bare hands, dumb idea, and squeezed it like you do a mattress as you're trying to carry it out, and it was wet. And knowing that was urine, at that point, I was like, getting it out. We got it out, threw it out in the trash, brought in new stuff. But I was thinking about the children that had to lay in that mess and go to that school. And I didn't get it. Like, I just couldn't wrap my head around that moment. I couldn't understand that completely. We realized long ago that at Coffee Creek, we didn't need to reinvent the wheel to do these kind of things. We needed to partner with people who were out there doing them. Some are faith-based organizations. Some, like today, are just a school-based organization, a nonprofit that we work with. We work with people that are doing good because we want to change the lives of people for good. And we don't have to agree with everything they do and understand every perspective they're at. We just have to do good. We're just here to bless. We're here to help out. If that's our time and serving, if that's our funding, if that's coming alongside them and collecting special things, whatever that looks like, we need to promote this idea of 100% participation. Not 20% does the 80%, nothing garbage like that. 100% of us need to help. Every single one of us needs to have that calling because that is what differentiates us. That is our difference. It's not that we call ourselves good or Christian or believer or that we have faith or that we pray or any of that. It's, are we following the way of Jesus? Or are we pretending? And that is a question only you can answer for yourself. Am I a Christ follower? Am I a pretender? Or am I kicking the tires? Some of you are just kicking the tires still. You're still curious about it. It's fine. Kick as long as you need to. But for those of you that want to say, I'm all in on this Jesus thing, you have to, at a certain point, decide if you are in more than just what you say, like you talk, but do you walk? And that's why we encourage 100% participation. For the very reason that Paul, when he was writing to his young friend Timothy, said this. He said, tell them to use their money to do good. They should be rich in good works and generous to those in need. Always be ready to share with others. Practicing is more important than preaching. And when I do this, I realize that there are faith elements tied to that. I don't just feel bad. Just like I said, God didn't say to just feel bad for people and look down on them. I don't just say my thoughts are with you, but if I say I'm thinking of you, I will really pray for you. And I need to let you know that I'm praying for you. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of the classic theologians from the Nazi era who was actually murdered by the Nazis, he said it this way. He said, a Christian fellowship lives and exists by the intercession, that is prayer, for others, the intercession of its members for one another, or it collapses. He says, I can no longer condemn or hate a brother for whom I pray, no matter how much trouble he causes me. He said that knowing that we would cause trouble for one another. We wouldn't always see eye to eye with one another. We would have different opinions. We would cheer for different teams. Some of you were broken up by OU's loss yesterday, and some of you kind of chuckled. That's bad. Very bad. Very bad of you. Creates division in the church. But at the end of the day, whether it's something silly like what team we root for or what political side we're on, or it's a bigger thing like if we're on the Mac or the PC side, right? Doesn't matter. That's my nerd coming out. Doesn't matter, right, what divides us. It matters what unites us. And if I'm praying for one another, I can't really get crossways too far with you. In a couple weeks, I'm going to do a 3-week series on prayer beginning October 27th. I'm so excited to share that with you. The power in prayer. We're going to talk about how prayer can be powerful, and that'll lead up to that special Sunday where I do a clinic on prayer. And I want to dive into that with you. I'm so excited to share that with you in just a couple weeks. And that series, if you just come on Sundays, will be there. I want to conclude with this. The bottom line for me is this in this series. The more we embrace those with different perspectives, the more we reflect Christ's love, the greater our ability to tell the world the good news. I feel like the more we circle the wagons with only people that look like us and act like us and believe exactly like us, the less ability we have to share the good news of what God has done for this world. It's why I shared my example of my atheist friends, because it's not like those conversations are like, hey, I believe in God, you should believe in God, and instantly they're like, yay, I agree. No, they're trying to sell me on their position a lot of the time. And I'm not trying to sell anything. I'm just trying to listen and have a conversation and keep those lines open, because I think it's valuable to have people that are outside of our context that understand the world differently, that see things differently. Because I think the more that we do that, and the more that we let them know, no matter what you do, I'm still going to love you. No matter what your opinion is, your philosophy is, I'm still going to love you. Even though I may not agree with that, and I don't want to sign up for your club or your organization or anything like that, I love you, and nothing can change that. That's what really has the power to change the world.